I love Spider-Man 2. At the ripe old age of 8, it was one of the most influential films I ever saw. It became a crucial source in understanding the character. In fact, one of my first ever video essays was a psychological analysis on it. And golly, for years, Tobey Maguire's voice was a main reference point for learning English, hence why I sound so American all the time. But as I went back and studied the original entire Stan Lee run, I was like, oh no, oh no, oh no. Because, what if I told you 90% of the assumptions the film preached were wrong, and it hit a tipping point when I reached issue 50? Spider-Man No More is 21 pages, and it marks the halfway point of Stan Lee's run. And it opens with just another day, where he stops a robbery, the woman is thankful, however the man is scared and he argues, how can we be sure he isn't as bad as the others? The Daily Bugle says he's a menace. Spider-Man is totally miffed. The city alienates him, but still hypocritically loves Daredevil and Captain America. Furthermore, Peter Parker's life begins to implode. Aunt May is ill for the third time, his grade begins to fall, and he has to decline Gwen's invitation. Furthermore, he doesn't have time to date Mary Jane, and he feels deeply unhappy over his inability to take Norman's offer, which is a pretty big difference with the Raimi movies. As a result, all the stress causes him to become vulnerable to JJ's anti-Spider-Man rhetoric, as he thinks to himself, but what if he's right? How can I have been so blind, never to have realized? Perhaps only a madman would do what I do. Taking the risk, accepting the dangers, and for what? After all these years, it's suddenly clear. I must be a glory-hungry fool, or worse. Therefore, this comic finally sets off the bomb that was planted in the very first issue, where Peter contemplates becoming the very villain JJ portrayed him, after he saved his frickin' son. So he quits. As a result, much like Far From Home and not like Spider-Man 2, Peter Parker doesn't surrender his responsibility over a girl or his own selfish desires, but because he believes quitting is the more responsible action, because if someone else's voice was louder than his own. So, if your main reference point for Spider-Man or the Raimi movies, then prepare to have your mind blown, because the differences run far deeper than organic web shooters. Instead, Spider-Man's motivations and the very fundamental message he presents are completely different, and Stan Lee's work will show you why. The next morning, a boy runs into JJ's office with Spider-Man's costume, which causes him to cheerfully print the story. New York is shocked and confused because everyone is vulnerable. As Frederick Foswell regretfully says, I don't have to be a genius to figure out what's going on. Spider-Man helped to keep the underworld on the run. They were disorganized, fearful, cautious, but now it's different. With the web slinger out of action, they're ready to pull their forces. However, as the city begins to decline, Peter's own life improves. He has a good time walking down the street, eating a hot dog, and actually no, the opposite happens. Real Peter Parker's life doesn't actually get better because everyone he didn't have time for now don't have time for him. Aunt May is automatically better and is off to the movies with Anna Watson. MJ is busy with her rehearsals, and as the thought boxes reveal, regardless if Peter did or didn't accept Gwen's invitation, she was always in love with him. When he confidently flirts with her, Gwen explains, "Oh, you lovable blind goof, can't you see I do?" As a result, as much as I love Spider-Man 2, it mind-blowingly doesn't get this story. The point of showing Peter Parker quitting isn't to show how much better his life would be, but to concretely show how little difference it would make. He literally says, "So I gave up being Spider-Man to have more time for my family and my friends, only to find out they don't need me. Might as well go home and bury myself in a book." Therefore, being Spider-Man isn't supposed to be a one-way sacrifice, but it's more emotionally akin to a hobby. Similar to Gwen's get-togethers that keep everyone together and connected, or Mary Jane's pursuit in acting, it's responsibility that gives Peter Parker healthy distraction and an output for his talent. This is how his personality is given more content, and this is especially noticeable within the first 30 issues, where you actively see Peter Parker become more and more confident and more popular. Peter Parker simply had a bad day and jumped the gun before everything improved on its own. It's that experience we've all had, when you panic, overthink, and overcorrect your own life and create a problem that wasn't actually there. The results really shouldn't be raindrops keep falling on my head. Furthermore, one of the major differences between Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man No More are the consequences. I know it sounds like a total meme because people often refer to Spider-Man 2 as a positive example of showing negative effects on Peter Parker's life, but that's the issue. It's only his personal life that's affected. There's no permanent or long-term ramifications on Spider-Man's side. Spider-Man as a character has two sides. There's the interpersonal melodrama with Peter Parker that's either treated as a miserable journey through hell, or a sitcom. See part 1 of my retrospective to get a clear idea of what I'm on about. And there's the crime drama side, with long-running cases, mysteries, and returning villains with escalating situations. In the movie, it only really cares about one side, because a New York without Spider-Man only results in one guy being mugged, a vague graph, an off-screen rando dying in a fire, and absolutely no police investigating Dr. Octopus, even though he's murdered loads of people, publicly robbed a bank, and threw an old lady off a building. In issue 50, do you know what happens? The Kingpin is introduced, because without Spider-Man, he finally enacts his plans to unite all of the crime gangs around and run them like a business. There's daylight robberies, attack on police officers, poor Frederick Foswell is beaten and kidnapped while he's undercover. The city is f***ed and we have to spend several issues cleaning it up. Therefore, the movie's vagueness is effectively designed to be dismissive, so you don't have to deal with Spider-Man's side afterwards, and he can exist in his goofy little isolated cartoony world, and that's great, I love this movie, but that's just wrong. The consequences shouldn't just be, oh, his friends are mad, but in the community of enemies he's unavoidably making that's creating more and more daggers over his head. The crime world needs to have weight, it needs to have dread. Spider-Man is supposed to be New York's antibody fighting off every virus, and without it, New York is never the same anymore. Things get so bad that Peter Parker has to save an officer from criminals as himself. Moreover, this action reminds him of Uncle Ben. And this is the precise moment when Uncle Ben went from just a guy to an anchor. And no one ever bloody brings this up, and it pisses me off because it's one of those myths that the Raimi movies and other media has infected into the mind of a whole generation of fans. Uncle Ben was just a dude who only appeared in 5 panels in Amazing Fantasy issue 15. He died off screen and never ever said, "With great power comes with great responsibility," because it came from a non-diegetic narration box. And within the original Stan Lee run, he was, mentioned only 3 times in 30 issues, and was overshadowed by Johnny Bloody Storm when it came to Peter Parker's role models. He was never a Jesus figure, and this difference is the result of Sam Raimi and Stan Lee's Spider-Man being basically 2 completely different people with completely different origins. In Amazing Fantasy issue 15, Peter still obviously starts out as a nerd who gets bitten by a radioactive spider, and then Uncle Ben dies. But where Sam Raimi gave him a loop, because he had Peter Parker start out as an unremarkable kind kid, who's not particularly smart nor witty, gains powers, become a jerk, but then the guilt from Uncle Ben's death pulls him back, and he spends the rest of his life going out of his way to stay the same sweet kid from before. Real Spider-Man's origin is more like a ribbon. Real Peter Parker already had great power and potential in him, for the reason that he's the only person who got a scholarship due to science, and he didn't get bitten out of random chance, he was literally the only person who wanted to go. And finally, and this is the most important one, Peter Parker was always a jerk, even before his powers. He bloody openly declared, "Someday I'll show them. Someday they'll be sorry that they laughed at me." And he frickin' let the criminal go, not to get back at someone, but just because he can. As a guy who was bullied, he was looking to find ways to hurt the world that once ignored him. He specifically says, "Sorry pal, that's your job. I'm through being pushed around by anyone. From now on, I just look out for number 1, that's me." These differences aren't decorative, they fundamentally change what Peter's lesson is and his trajectory in life, for the reason that in the comics, Ben's death doesn't make him go, "Oh no, I need to go back to the way I was." Instead, his death puts on display how flawed Peter's thinking is. Therefore, by being Spider-Man, he doesn't go back to the way he was, a kid looking to rise up on the bullying food chain in order to inflict the same pain he experienced himself, but he breaks the cycle of douchebaggery, to use his strength not to bully like Flash did to him, but to protect others. Real Spider-Man isn't about how noble it is to hold on and stay the same, it's about the importance of changing your fundamental attitude with others when you hit a certain point in life. This is why Peter Parker's most consistent antagonist throughout Stan Lee's run is J. Jonah Jameson. He's who Peter Parker could have been if he grew up without letting go of his narcissistic and selfish outlook. And it's why in this story, the starting point is Jonah Jameson and it ends with Uncle Ben. Peter Parker learns to listen to his conscience by reassociating himself with Uncle Ben's memory. As he declares, "I can never permit one innocent being to come to harm because Spider-Man failed to act." This is a direct rebuttal of J. Jonah Jameson's argument. Peter's sacrifice is not his happiness with his social circles, but to listen to his own voice while always being harassed. This reaches its symbolic climax when Peter Parker reclaims his Spider-Man costume from JJ. And now, Spidey's back in action, and as far as the world's concerned, they better believe it. So Spider-Man, as a responsibility, isn't his loyalty to someone else, but his loyalty with himself. The boy who was gaslit into thinking that what he was doing was wrong finds salvation through believing in himself. Therefore, it is crucial that Uncle Ben grows from an unimportant place, because it marks an important shift, a new stage in his life. The first 30 issues are like a sitcom, the next 20 issues is a melodrama, and now it's become a crime saga. These phases in different tones are incredibly important because it's what makes Spider-Man a real and dynamic character who's always changing, who lives in a world that makes you laugh, cry, and then come to accept it. In both terms, like our own lives as we leave our teens and enter our 20s. However, because the Raimi movies had artificially inflated Uncle Ben's importance, they couldn't do any of this. Instead, they had to flip it. Spider-Man 2 is about Peter Parker dismissing Uncle Ben, then realizing he was right all along, and then going back to the same place he started with. He doesn't grow or change, and the world he lives in doesn't feel any different. Instead, he's only lucky that someone else had the balls to make the decision for him. If this was real Spider-Man, he would have let his first love go, and we would have faded forward by a few years and have him bump into her after she's married, and realize that, yeah, his feelings were those of a boy, not of a man. I know this because one of my favorite Spider-Man moments of all time is this very moment from issue 41, as Peter Parker privately thinks, "Once I thought I couldn't live without her. Now, she's just another girl named Betty. Boy, have I grown up in these past few months. I realize now we never had anything in common. It's just that she was the first girl I loved." I adore this scene because it's so real and subversive. It doesn't give in to the cliche of the whole one true love since childhood. Spider-Man doesn't look back. He always looks forward. Okay? Subsequently, if I had to summarize the difference between Sam Raimi's Spider-Man and Stan Lee's Spider-Man, is that one is about letting go and the other is about holding on. Stan Lee's Peter Parker is someone who learns to absorb the progress he made and let go of his insecurities, let go of the narcissistic asshole he was before he got his powers, let go of his need for vindication, and let go of his awkwardness to take charge confidently of his own life. Spider-Man 2 is about holding on to someone else's dream, holding on to his first love, and holding on to his innocence, because to change, he would risk losing his kindness. The movie goes as far as using Peter Parker letting go of Mary Jane as a false climax, because she comes back. He gets what he's holding out for because that's who he is. That's the existential limits of him as a character in these films. And don't get me wrong, that's a beautiful message. Spider-Man 2 is a beautiful film that I love, but I have to say, it's just not very Spider-Man. Underneath my critical position, I hope my message of love is not lost, because I'm not writing this essay to crap all over Spider-Man 2 or Sam Raimi, but to highlight Stan Lee's work because there's a real heartbreaking lack of affection or even simply knowledge of them. It's popular now for people to turn their backs on Stan Lee's work in order to fetishize the Raimi trilogy. I was in that group myself. My original Spider-Man trilogy analysis was written as a defense back when it was mainly a subject of mockery. However, now it seems like we've completely swung the other way, and the public's idea of what Spider-Man is and should be is completely distorted, to the extent that the other films that adapt the character more closely to the comics and therefore defy Raimi's changes, they tend to get crapped all over. Paul Andrew Garfield finally did the confident, flirty trickster act from Stan Lee's run, and he gets poo-pooed all over. The MCU finally pushed Uncle Ben out of the way to focus on Peter Parker's relationship with other heroes, just like in the first 30 issues, and even followed the sitcom tone, and he gets ridiculed for it. Stan Lee's original run is a saga about living through different phases in life, and how our responsibility is what carries us with a smile. And I think it's bloody time that people know about it.
I'm so confused right now, baby.
However, there is one important scene that is really similar to the Raimi movie, and it's when Peter finally asks Gwen out. In tears, she says, "I don't know you anymore, and I can't stop." Actually, I'm joking. Gwen likely rejects Peter Parker because she has a date with Harry. But Peter Parker does try to get Gwen to cheat on Harry by gaslighting her into believing they were already together, and no, actually confidently smiles and has a relaxing afternoon.